Welcome to our tutorial session in the run-up to ESORICS 2021 about the evolution of privacy during COVID-19 pandemic with Professor Anna Squicciarini and Dr. Sarah Rajtmajer. Professor Squicciarini is interested in investigating various aspects of data privacy, security, and online societal problems. She uses system techniques as well as access control and machine learning and a bit of game theory. To date, she works primarily on security topics related to data control, management, and distribution and oversharing. Here they are, Professor Anna Squicciarini and Dr. Sarah Rajtmajer.
Thank you very much for the great introduction, and I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Dr. Rajtmajer and I are very pleased to be invited to give an opportunity to discuss this important topic related to privacy, and particularly how privacy perspectives have changed over the past year and a half in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. We will present an overview of various privacy-related topics that have seen great impact during 2020 and part of 2021. This is a work that is carried out at Penn State University where Dr. Rajtmajer and I are hosted, and it's partly funded by the National Science Foundation. Okay. All right. So as you all know, and I'm sure we have all experienced to some degree, no matter which country we are in or were in during the pandemic, of course, this pandemic crisis has been unprecedented in many respects, including the way it has impacted individuals' health, physical health, and also mental health. We know that during this difficult time where isolation was forced to populations with various degrees and length and so forth, there have been several negative impacts on mental health. We're starting talking about mental health because the way people have responded to isolations is by resorting to online resources, as we will discuss shortly. What we have seen, however, before we get into that, is that there has been a great impact in terms of depression, panic, stress, anxiety, and so forth. And the statistics are staggering, no matter which country you're looking at. And they clearly show that this has been a trying time, not only from the health-related domain or like the physical health-related areas, but also mental well-being. The reason why we talk about mental well-being is because what we have observed in response, at least to some extent, to these stressful times is an unprecedented surge in online activities. People have resorted to on the online world for a number of reasons. And as we will discuss in a moment, this has been partly voluntary choice. People have resorted to social media, for example, to connect with others, to strengthen their ties, to look for help and support during trying times. But also some of it has been imposed by the new way of living that was forced upon us as we were no longer allowed to be physically close to each other. For example, video conferencing or the use of online social media sites, not only for entertainment, but also to have conferences or meet clients or service providers and so forth have become a reality of everyday life. And even though we are slowly getting out of this difficult time, we're still seeing a lot of this online life continuing beyond the restrictions that are now loosened in many countries across the world. Of course, the benefit of disconnectedness are countless. Internet technologies have allowed many to continue to work through this period and children to continue schooling. Telehealth has expanded access to essential health services. And of course, contact tracing apps and digital surveillance measures offered hope for virus tracking and containment. We have suggested, and we will argue, in this tutorial, as we present, is how privacy has changed over the past years, that social media has provided an avenue for collective coping, wherein users can solicit and receive emotional and informational and instrumental support. Online sharing also serves therapeutic functions and enables sense-making in crisis. However, that comes with some important costs. What we know and what we have read over and over is, of course, the pandemic has put people online now more than ever. However, their data is followed, and this has raised a number of privacy issues. Some of these are perceived privacy issues. Some of those are actual privacy risks that people have experienced. We have seen this, as I mentioned before, this compulsory and voluntary lifestyle changes that have put our data in online in a constant form or in a constant fashion. For example, in the US, our HIPAA, which is the health-related regulatory framework, had changed some of its restrictions so as to allow healthcare providers, for example, to use non-HIPAA compliant services, such as FaceTime, Facebook Messenger, and Skype, to communicate with patients. That means that in potentially unsecure channels, or at least non-compliant channels, one might share very sensitive information about their personal, physical, and mental health. We also have seen, as lifestyle has changed, a rise of what we call self-privacy violations. What we mean by it, and we'll spend a third of our talk discussing this, is that a lot of individuals have started voluntarily sharing highly sensitive information in order to benefit from that collective coping that I just mentioned earlier. The idea of leaving individuals feeling more comfortable and socially connecting during a time wherein physical closeness was not possible. What we think is that we are looking at an evolution of privacy risk-taking during this crisis. And I want to mention here, although this is not in the slide, that this is interesting, particularly because when the pandemic hit, we were actually experiencing as society a big uptick or interest in more privacy conservative choices across companies and across privacy advocates and users who are not privacy advocates, but they finally understood the challenges with privacy. I'm referring, for example, to the Cambridge Analytica scandal that brought privacy in the forefront of everyone's mind, or Apple's stance and other big corporations on privacy in face of important acute crisis, where Apple really took a stance to protect individuals' privacy against government surveillance mechanisms and so forth. So we were experiencing this big, uptick in privacy, the introduction of the GDPR regulations and so forth. However, it seems that the pandemic has slowed down the effort to protect individuals' privacy in face of this pandemic crisis. So we're going to cover during this presentation a couple of topics that are related to this privacy change over the COVID-19 crisis. And the first one that, of course, I have to cover is related to contact tracing. So contact tracing, as you all know, refers to the process of notifying contacts of exposure, addressing questions, and referring to COVID-19 testing, encouraging, of course, self-quarantine and monitoring of symptoms and so forth. Contact tracing in the beginning of the pandemic had started in a manual fashion, with investigators manually trying to identify people who might have been exposed. However, the computer science community has immediately stepped up and tried to deal with contact tracing in a semi-automated fashion, if not truly automated. And this is motivated by the hope that by doing contact tracing, by using contact tracing technologies, one could achieve more efficient and scalable contact tracing that might allow the lockdown measures to be relaxed quickly and have a better, scalable contact tracing protocols in place. However, this has been a very controversial topic over the past year. I want to start by just giving an overview of how this actually works. So underlying contact tracing apps, and here I put a screenshot of the Italian contact tracing app, but I could have put many others because, of course, nearly every country in the past 12 to 16 months have come up with their own app. All of them fundamentally rely on Bluetooth low energy messages. This can be configured to transmit beacons at regular interval. And the idea is that the signal strength with which the beacon is received provides a rough measure of the distance between the transmitter and the receiver. So when the received signal strength is sufficiently high, then this might indicate a contact event. And conversely, when the received signal strength is sufficiently low, then this may indicate that the handsets are not in close proximity. This is the underlying technology, these beacons, these Bluetooth messages that are sent. And how they are actually deployed is roughly as I described here. And you can see here the source that elaborates on this. But the idea is that you have a handheld device, a phone, that starts using these messages to constantly scan for nearby phones. When the two phones connect, they swap some anonymous ID codes. And I have highlighted this because, as you well can imagine, this is where privacy considerations may come into place. Anyways, if the user tests positive for COVID-19, then the health department will ask permission to notify possibly exposed people. And if there is consent, then the code will be sent to they'll send the code to enter into the app. At this point, the code authorizes the phone to send its ID codes still anonymous to a central service, which is managed by the state or a national health authority. And following this, the phone will check for server for new IDs that have been associated with positive tests and cross-reference them against the one that it has collected over the past 2 weeks. So we have a list of anonymous ID codes that get matched against central servers. These central servers are governed and managed by health authorities. And this is done to anonymous ID codes in order to protect one's privacy. Like I said, this is, however, been a very, this is a very general scheme to provide for this technology. The actual nature of implementation and how it has been deployed has changed over the year, and also it is different depending on what country you are looking at. The nature of implementation can either be open source or private. Of course, as privacy and security advocates, we all know that there are different considerations to be made and advantages and disadvantages on whether you are considering open sources or private protocols. Of course, the open source, like for example, the BlueTrace, offer the benefits of being widely available to the research community who can really dig into the underlying framework and software and therefore possibly identify security vulnerabilities. On the other hand, private technologies have been also used widely in this particular case. In particular, I want to mention this GAPPTP, which is the Google-Apple effort. This was the first effort that was made by the two big corporations, Google and Apple, to come up with an exposure notification protocol that would go beyond the apps mechanism that I just explained, but they would be embedded seamlessly into our devices. And of course, we all, for example, if you have an iPhone, if your software, your iOS is, I think it has to be version 13 or over, this is automatically enabled or at least installed on your phone without the need to installing a specific app. Also, the way the network is controlling this message exchange protocol at the lower level is interesting and has changed over the year. We have seen at first a centralized mechanism in place where, again, the main server would be managed by health organization, and they would be in charge pretty much of the message passing across the multiple devices. and then we have shifted to a decentralized, or many states and technologies have looked into decentralized architectures. And here is a nice schema of how this differ in order to better protect privacy and so forth. Now, I should say, in both centralized and decentralized framework, what we're looking at is a similar, as you can see from the first part of the schemata here, we're looking at a similar approach. There is a phone that the infected users will provide his coded key and the codes for other keys to a third party. The third party is a centralized health organization. What changes is afterward. In the decentralized report processing protocols, while you still have a central reporting server, for example, this central health organization, we delegate the responsibility to process logs to clients on the network. Therefore, tokens exchanged by clients contain no intrinsic information or static identifiers, and protocols using this approach basically have the client upload the number from which encounter tokens can be derived by individual devices. This is different because, again, we don't have the health organizations that performs this computation. Of course, there are some disadvantages as well, such as possible higher false positives and full reliance on client devices that might not be as robust and so forth. But from a privacy standpoint, this has been seen as more effective. Nevertheless, these technologies have brought a lot of concerns that range from efficacy, how actually effective they are, to data management, ranging, of course, into the privacy issues, which I will discuss a little bit more next. When it comes to efficacy, the reality is that this Bluetooth LE device that were configured to transmit these beacons were not designed for this purpose. And therefore, when they were first deployed, it wasn't quite clear how effective they would be, and particularly whether they would serve the purpose of proximity detection, the way contact tracing requires, essentially. There are some interesting early studies that have studied the efficacy of these messages and possible limitations. For example, is the message strong enough? Is the message strong enough in presence of walls, indoor, outdoor, when there are some big barriers between individuals? Can the message detect, can these beacons detect a possible false positive? For example, when people are isolated through walls or plexiglass, but they're still physically close to each other. These are all still early findings that require, I think, a lot more systematic analysis in order to give a final answer. The other issues, of course, have been on the role of health authorities in managing this sensitive data, the trust that is put into this health authority and and governments to manage this sensitive data. And of course, most importantly, we're dealing with privacy issues. There have been a strong skepticism among individuals. Individuals have, populations across multiple countries have really taken a while to trust these technologies. Particularly from monitoring them constantly, which was the perceived sensation from most users, and therefore we have seen limited penetration. You can see here in this map how there are different degrees of penetrations across country, with some countries having nearly no penetration. And this is a few months old, but I expect it to be consistent with today's data. And others that have reached up until, for example, in Singapore, 80%. The problem is that, first of all, some serious concerns that arise beyond privacy is that, first of all, the basic science of transmission is not settled yet. The problem of what does it constitute close enough proximity is still ill-defined. We know with the Delta variant, for example, 15 minutes seems to be too long to be considered to be considered exposure. You need to adjust that time to much shortened time frame, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Also, another issue is that these technologies have pop up in a kind of fragmented fashion. Different architecture, different technologies for communication, different cryptographic protocols. This has led to some fragmented results. For people travel, for example, they have to install the local app, or they need to enable their iOS or operating system to detect exposure notifications from the current location. The skepticism has been still high, even if when we have moved to decentralized architectures, that probably would have led to a little bit better, should have led to a little bit more privacy considerations or privacy confidence in the privacy of the data. And also, finally, I want to mention it is that the success of these apps itself doesn't seem to yet directly connected with the ability of a country to withstand the COVID-19 crisis. For example, there's no clear connection between the mortality rate and the success of adoption. If you look at countries like Japan and so forth, where we have had very low adoption, they still have performed very well when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the actual benefit of these apps are still unclear. They have not quite been as strong as one would have hoped, or the computer science community would have hoped.
So the next topic out of three that we sort of broke this into is the specific prevalence of the sharing and reporting of individual health data, which has been very critical for organizations as they get back into operational in-person, as well as healthcare providers, and the online social media and Google and other small tech companies have all contributed to facilitate data-driven responses to the pandemic. One really interesting example was with a thermometer that's widely used in the US, the Kinsa Thermometer, which reports thermometers digitally back to a central service. And the Kinsa company sort of announced early on in the pandemic in March, late March of 2020, that they were able to predict spikes in COVID rates a week before they were noticed and reported confirmed cases and showing up in hospitals and so forth. And they were using just the temperature readings and the amount of times temperatures were being taken in various areas. And so this was very interesting news last year in March, but actually to this day, so even just a few weeks ago, now our New York City public schools have decided that they will use this technology as well in order to allow children to go back to school, especially in the metropolitan area of New York next fall. And so many have experienced this rise in temperature taking and sharing of individual temperature data. And it has allowed, it has allowed children to go back to school and individuals to return to working environments. This is a read from the Kinsa Health Weather Service. So they've actually stood up a website that you can visit if you're in the US, and you can put in your state and your county, and you can learn what they feel is the risk in your area at the moment. This is our area, so we're very happy to have low risk at the moment based on these temperature readings. So this is not the only, by any means, service of this sort. That was just one kind of small and interesting example of a small company. But in the meantime, there has been a massive collective effort across universities and medical centers throughout the world to contribute to this one very interesting initiative, global.health. And you can go there and you can see now over 43 million individual level case data, of course, anonymously shared, and various analytics put on top of this in order to support researcher and medical professionals' understanding of the pandemic and the risk areas and trends and so forth. And so this sort of unprecedented sharing of personal data at this point has been more good than bad, in the sense that there has not been a breach of privacy in this data, but it is the beginning of a very interesting moment of sharing of personal health data. And so there's some nice articles, this one in Nature earlier this year, highlighting not only the opportunity, but also some of the risks. Along with this, what we've seen due to the nature of the pandemic and the social distancing requirements and the lack of movement, we have a more disjointed care process than ever before. So individuals were, and this is something Anna touched on, using telehealth more frequently, and trying to do drive-through screenings, and also pop-up medical care centers were stood up in many places. So in the United States, this happened at sporting arenas, turned into hospitals, and tents were stood up in parking lots to give COVID tests. And so how to organize the transfer and coordinate the management and sharing of this data was sort of very ad hoc and on the fly. And actually this article in the Journal of the American Medical Association from last June was very critical of the imposition of privacy regulations in hindering this process. So in worrying about people's privacy and in the usual restrictions for data sharing, there was, slowed ability to actually cope with the pandemic. And so that's what we see as the beginning of trade-offs. And all these conversations reflect privacy trade-offs. Of course, we value privacy, but the pandemic has held privacy up against public safety and health and economics. And so one way that we currently see this trade-off discussed is looking forward is in the light of the vaccines and vaccine sharing information, as well as COVID health data sharing information. So for some time, folks in the US were worried that having had COVID and having that be public information or be available to insurance companies would make individuals less insurable. Now, moving forward, there's a push for everyone to share vaccination status, but that is also being pushed back by many individual workplaces. And the discussion of sharing COVID vaccination information and so-called vaccine passports has turned to more state-of-the-art privacy ideas like blockchain and the mechanisms that might allow us to have it all in terms of protecting personal privacy and also having critical information about COVID-related history as well as vaccine status moving forward protected. Some interesting work in the HCI community has looked at how people feel about these trade-offs. So what are the new user perceptions of privacy in this time of COVID? And of course, there's a multitude of factors at play. People are worried about their health, and we're generally focused on, and especially at the height of the pandemic, on sharing whatever information they could in order to contribute to the public welfare, so altruism, but then also very worried about the audience of their health information. And so the two critical factors that this interesting paper pulled out were audience, so they did who would know and for how long that data would be available, as well as the tension of contributing to the public good. So this notion of how people feel about sharing their information and how they are willing to and what trade-offs they make when they share personal information is formalized in the literature around self-disclosure. And so this is sort of very related, of course, but beyond just health data, to these questions of why people share information, when they share information, and how they make some, implicit calculation to do so. Here is what I mean by self-disclosure very concretely. Here's a simple sentence that was posted on Reddit. This person saying, I'm a father of 4, and what do? I have children with special needs. I work as a DJ, and I'm suffering right now in my business. And so you can see in this simple post that this individual has shared a number of critical personal information, their family status, location, professional status, and so forth. And the literature on self-disclosure suggests that this person may have done this in seeking support or relationship building. And the theory behind that is called social penetration theory. So self-disclosure for relationship development, even online in a situation where it wouldn't seem like relationship development is necessarily at the heart of this, but it is still part of this scenario where individuals seek support. And from the very first slide of this presentation, we noted that in fact, this time of isolation and mental health crisis is a time when we're seeing more and more of this. But again, there are risks associated with self-disclosure. It may not be very risky to an individual to say that they, work in a particular business, but it may be more risky if they share other information that can be used by current or future actors who may not have their best interests at heart. So some of the work that we have done and that others have done have sought to better understand self-disclosure in the COVID context. And so in order to do so, especially in large-scale data, we need tools to automatically detect and categorize self-disclosure. And at the present time, many of these tools focus on dividing disclosure sort of at the high level into 2 types or 3 types. But 2 main types are emotional disclosure and informational disclosure. So you can disclose a feeling, opinion, a subjective content, and this might be more related to mental health, but you can also share factual information about you, your age, your birthday, and your family members, and so forth. And each of these different types of disclosures bring with them very different risks. Emotional disclosure may bring risks of manipulation, while informational disclosure might bring risks of, for example, identity theft. During the COVID pandemic, the research that has been going on for just 1 year, but still has left open questions about lack of understanding self-disclosure in a time of crisis, limited interpretation of voluntary disclosure in terms of crisis as a perceived trade-off. So again, there's a robust literature on privacy trade-offs, or the so-called privacy calculus, where individuals make a conscious decision what to share or unconscious decision what to share. However, that calculus, it has likely shifted at this moment, and may or may not generally apply to other crises of various sorts. And we've explored that a little bit, which I'll discuss in a few slides. And finally, what do we do about it, actually? How do we intervene when the user's sharing of personal information is fully voluntary, shall we warn them, or shall we set up systems that inherently build in greater data protection? What are things that we can do to facilitate privacy in this unique scenario where individuals are voluntarily sharing information? There has been some big data pushes to collect, especially tweets, but also data from other social media. So Twitter has released their Twitter COVID data stream, and other universities have been collecting tweets from early January of 2020 around these sample around keywords related to COVID, and some of them are here on the slide. And so we did a few studies on this data. The first one that I'll share is from January 2020 through the end of 2020, ultimately through October 3rd and then through December, to look at whether we see any changes in self-disclosure behavior during this time. And so in order to do this, we used several different methods for self-disclosure detection. One was unsupervised, so dictionary-based. Others are semi-supervised. And we also had individuals manually label some tweets to serve as training data along various dimensions of self-disclosure. In our latest work, we use deep learning along with frames, so semantic role labels, which can serve as features to our deep neural language models, so BERT-based models, to automatically tag self-disclosure along two dimensions, informational and emotional disclosure, in short text. And we do this on tweets and on Reddit posts. We also, as I mentioned, have unsupervised models, generally using dictionary-based approaches. And so those models often rely on signals, for example, first-person pronouns, I, me, or my, showing up, and then some other words like that may indicate categories of personal information, like location or age-related information, and so on. And what we find is that we saw a very large uptick in the percentage of self-disclosure in COVID-related tweets right at the time of height of the pandemic, and that at least through the end of 2020, that uptick did not slow down in any way. And so what we saw is, and so the plot here on the slide shows the percentage of self-disclosure over at a per day rate for each day from January 20th through, I believe, September 1st. And you can see we've lined up some of the critical events. This was English language tweets in the pandemic. And so we saw the most significant uptick in the month of March, as you can see, in the sharing of personal information. And so one question we have is about the long-term trajectory of this. In this study, and this is not on the slide, but we compared this trend to the similar, using the same analysis in a data set of a large hurricane that occurred in the United States a few years back called Hurricane Harvey. And Hurricane Harvey was very sort of important in the literature on crisis management through social media, because it was the first crisis where people were really going straight to social media to discuss what was going on, to ask for help, and to solicit information and support during the crisis. Now, Hurricane Harvey was very different than COVID because Hurricane Harvey was a few days, and the crisis related conversation went on for, a month. However, the really critical crisis was very short. And also the really critical period of crisis took down a lot of internet infrastructure. So this crisis is very different in character, mostly because of the long-term nature. And so I think the nuance in the various crises situation is very critical. And so we have posed a research agenda around understanding this more so moving forward. And Anna, if you want to pick up from here, I can just continue to share my screen.
Yes. Okay, so I want to shift to just a more pointed question here, which is related to whether or not this change of behavior has actually represented or represents a new privacy risk or heightened privacy risk, I should say. So what we try to do in this study, and as we all know, all of us who work in the privacy space know that one of the challenges with privacy is actually measure privacy risks or quantify privacy loss, particularly if we are looking at unstructured data and live data or streaming data, like the case of online social media and online environments where users willingly and in a very disjoint and discrete asynchronous fashion share personal information about themselves and their personal experience. So what we try to tackle here, and this is just an attempt, and it's again an open research question, probably how to do it better. But anyway, what we try to do is to measure privacy risks in the context of online conversations when we consider a possible privacy risk, this idea of self-disclosure. So what we realize is that not all self-disclosure utterances will represent a risk, and we realize that there's a lot more than what we will cover here. Of course, there is the problem of inference, and there is the problem of what is already shared with the community prior to that conversation. But we're focusing here on conversations that may constitute a risk to individuals' privacy. What we look at is particularly this idea of reciprocation. So the fact that we observe that users tend to reciprocate in discourse, and this we know from social literature, that self-disclosure is often reciprocated because, again, it helps with social connectedness, and it helps support one's conversation. What we claim is that users may be at risk or at least may experience heightened privacy risks if they stand out in an online public discourse. So you can move on, Sarah. No, okay. So this might be due to the rarity of their disclosed content or to the frequency of rate of self-disclosure compared to a given group. Our approach that we have developed, which is based on information theoretic measures, aims at highlighting both disclosing norm in an online conversation, as well as disclosures in the discourse that are not homogeneous. Some disclosures stand out and highlight the users engaged in such disclosure, leading therefore to potentially heightened privacy risks. Essentially, what we want to do is, by using Janus-Shannon diverse, and quantify how distinguishable two or more distributions are. And we have been detecting, therefore, trends of self-disclosure that stand out in terms of both frequency and content. And you can move on, sir. And the assumption is that if you have users whose distribution of self-disclosure is different from the distribution of the group, then it's more likely the case that these users will stand out. Of course, I'm leaving aside the details about how to detect with the content of self-disclosure, which, as I mentioned earlier, is also need to be accounted for. But here we're just looking at trends, and users who disclose more as compared to others, they are probably not reciprocating, and therefore they're more likely identifiable within a group. You can move on. We have looked at various data sets to compute this, and a couple of data sets that we have looked at use Reddit and they use Twitter, and we also use a reference data set from news discourse prior to the pandemic. And we'll examine content similarity in conversations with different variations in users' JS discourse and look at the possible reciprocation effect. The main finding that I want to report is that within a conversation for all the data sets we have seen, is that users more similar in disclosure pattern also tend to share similar content. This shows evidence of reciprocation, and also provides this idea of probably perceived privacy, where because everybody's sharing, I feel more comfortable sharing possibly highly sensitive information. Now, as I said earlier, this is just a pointer to a possible interesting research direction, because we do not account for many other factors. For example, importantly, inference issues that may be due not as much for one's explicit behavior, but more about more from network connections and other activities in an online or in a social media site. Another piece that I would like to mention here is that sometimes self-disclosure is also a possible instrument to better understand group dynamics and online network dynamics. And what we have seen is that users who tend to group together by way of communicating with one another with acts of self-disclosure seem to travel together through the pandemic. They seem to navigate together across time. What that is telling us is essentially that users used self-disclosure as some sort of social glue to talk to one another, and this seems to carry across time. This is interesting because we are not even talking here about the possible audience outside the users who interact with one another. I think what we're looking at here is a perceived sense of close group that happens and lasts over time that makes users feel more comfortable, and we have seen this with statistical evidence, more comfortable sharing personal facts across time, ignoring the fact that they're still in a public setting, in fact, in a very public platform like Twitter. So far, we're only talked about high-level self-disclosures and these trends over time. We have not talked about topics. We have done several analyses looking at the type of self-disclosure, because as I started saying at the beginning, we know that not all self-disclosures are equal. Particularly now in the literature, you will distinguish between at least informational and emotional disclosure, with informational disclosure being facts being disclosed, like, for example, sharing demographics, sharing facts, events, and so forth, versus everything that is emotional, a personal feeling and an opinion, a thoughts, and so forth. What we have seen is that this, can you go back, Sarah, sorry. What we have seen is that the topics in self-disclosure, in COVID-related conversations, definitely change over time. And particularly, we did an analysis pre-pandemic, and these are the word clouds on my left of the slide, and during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we've seen is a surge in some very specific and more directly, more personal topics. You can see are the keywords of topic 5 and 6, which even though visually you cannot see the difference, they actually represent almost 50% of the tweets that we analyzed for this analysis. And they are all linked to support, work, health, very personal topic, of course, COVID-19, because that's the main subject, but also keywords such as need, money, corona, and so forth. Now, we took a step forward because, again, this is a very high-level view of this analysis by looking at, first of all, yes, you can stay here, at the disclosure of diseases and symptoms. So we know, I should preface that a lot of the information that users share is emotional, is not necessarily fact related, and it might be related to basic demographic facts that one can infer even without an act of self-disclosure. So we zoomed our attention, we focused on truly sensitive disclosure, or at least health-related disclosure, which as a broad category are usually considered as private by HIPAA regulation and many others. So what we use is, again, a bear-based approach, so a semi-supervised approach to infer health and related data or tweets. We trained this model and we achieve high accuracy, and we can report that we found very health-focused discussion, particularly prominent within what we call the persistent groups that I mentioned earlier. About 29% of all the tweets that were in these persistent groups, and again, persistent groups are these groups of individuals which we have seen communicating with one another on Twitter across multiple months, where all of these, about 29% were health-related, and 83% had at least some health-related tweets. And I don't have here the slide, but when we say health-related, we're talking about speaking about diagnosis, about being healed, about symptoms, hospitalization, and testing, and so forth. And what we saw is that 99%, in fact, more specifically, as you can see here, 99.7% of these health-related tweets belong to 7 topics that featured health-related keywords that I just mentioned. Zooming in on these health-related tweets, we saw that there was some informational disclosure rating, and we detected that the primary disclosures were of personal ailments and symptoms, which is exactly the argument, supporting the argument about self-disclosure as possibly leading toward highly sensitive information disclosure. I think we can skip this because it's already 9:53, Sarah, so you can go back. Okay, so the last observation I want to make here is on something potentially darker, and this idea of online influence. And probably you have seen, and we have talked, you know about the problem with the external influence that dominate or try to control public discourse. And we have seen this particularly with malicious actors, perhaps with government actors, trying to even control important societal events such as politics. Now, one of the things that we started looking at here is whether, for example, self-disclosure is an influenced behavior as well, particularly one that might be triggered by accounts that benefit from heightened trust. And we looked at verified accounts. The idea of verified accounts is that they attract more traffic and are highly visible and highly popular. And of course, the suspicion here is that the reply of tweets generated by verified accounts, if they include safe disclosure, they might actually be at higher risks of privacy loss because of the heightened visibility of the source account. And of course, what we have seen as the pandemic evolves, you can go to the next one. As we have seen as the pandemic evolves, and I should say this is a very early finding, is that self-disclosing parent tweets, where by parent tweet I mean the beginning of a conversation, are more likely to be replied to with self-disclosures in child than tweets with non-self-disclosing tweets. While this is not consistent across time, what we see is that there is essentially this peer effect in the case of non-verified parent users that increase of effect. Whereas we don't see any significant peer effects in the case of verifying parent tweet. Essentially, verified tweets are effective in stimulating self-disclosure, but this is not reciprocal. And also, this seems to be not consistent across time. There is a change over time in the increase of replies with self-disclosure. Okay.
And finally, we wanted to note some critical differences amongst individual users. So we've been discussing here users as a single homogeneous entity, but there's very important work emerging on, in particular, underrepresented users, or users of low socioeconomic status, which I denote here SES, and the particular challenges they face with respect to protecting their privacy. And so, one moment, I'd like to, oops, I missed a slide. And so a lot of the work that had been done prior to COVID, really emerging starting in 2015, was about the perceptions of users of low income or minority users of their privacy online. And ultimately, a number of reports, this Data and Society report on the lower right-hand side of the screen, discusses the additional worries that individuals feel who are low income or minority or older individuals. And at the same time that they're more worried about their privacy, they also take fewer steps to really protect their privacy. And so what we wanted to do, and we actually started, this is such an interesting study because it started before COVID, and then COVID happened in the middle of our study. But we decided to recruit users to participate in a study with an experimental and a control condition, where we first surveyed users. So we got a lot of very fine-grained information about their age, gender, race, and ethnicity, location, education, income, and their privacy attitudes. Then we tracked them for 1 month on Twitter, and we collected all of their tweets and their replies to tweets and their retweets, and we labeled them for various categories of self-disclosure. And what we were expecting to see was maybe some corroboration or refutation of the hypotheses in prior work about impacts of socio-demographics on privacy behaviors. What we found no significant relationship when it came to race, ethnicity, but we did find males disclosed significantly less personal information than females, and individuals with a higher education were also less likely to share personal information. So as I mentioned, COVID hit midway through the study, and we did try to do some analysis on a before and after. However, it was really taking place during the month of the data collection. So I think, it's an open question. We did not find a significant difference before and after with respect to the groups and their perceptions of privacy. I think, so we want to end here in the last 60 seconds with highlighting some of the technical challenges for the community. It's very hard to detect self-disclosure in user-generated text, especially if you want to detect fine-grained categories. And so this has been a very active area of research over the last few years, but remains an open challenge. It's also critical, we know, that there are contextual influences on self-disclosure, the audience, whether there's a crisis, which has been the focus of this talk, personality, social network effects, peer effects, which Anna highlighted a little bit with respect to the verified users. But that is poorly understood. And so that's an area of critical importance for future work. And then, of course, better assessing the privacy implications of observed self-disclosure. Not every voluntary sharing of information is a privacy worry. But as we look at inference tools and technologies moving forward, we know that seemingly harmless disclosures can actually be worrying. And finally, we need to unify tracing technologies for better confidence and efficacy so that privacy guarantees are increased and therefore users are more comfortable with adoption. So this is my last slide. Sort of at a high level, we hope that we have outlined what appears to be a shift in users' privacy attitudes, particularly given the extended nature of this pandemic, and highlighted whether, we have posed it as a potential tipping point in terms of privacy attitudes, but that remains to be confirmed, I think, as we come out of this period and move forward. And then, of course, it's unclear who particularly is impacted and whether these impacts are equitable. And so I think that that's going to be another critical area of work. So we just want to acknowledge 3 of our grad students who were critical to this effort, as well as our funding through the NSF Coronavirus Response Rapid Program. And so there was one question in the chat, but I guess I'll stop for now since we're at 10 o'clock and see if we have time for that. There are 2 questions.
Go ahead if you like.
Okay, sure. So the first was about the representativeness of Twitter, Reddit users Yeah, of course. I think it's a limitation of our data. We are studying users' behavior online. So certainly this Twitter and Reddit does not represent everyone who is online. And anyway, many people are not online. But that is an open question. I think Reddit is less representative, but Twitter, there's sort of a well-outlined space of how Twitter is or is not representative. So the average Twitter user is younger than the average user of the population. So elderly people are less well represented, for example. So that is certainly an issue. And then, Anna, I'll let you take the second one. Has there been evidence of increased efforts to exploit or capitalize on this heightened self-disclosure phenomenon during COVID? You're muted. Yes.
I don't know of any like huge outcry. I do know that there were multiple privacy experts and researchers, for example, from Cornell University, highlighting the big concerns for possible data exploitation. Particularly, as Sarah has mentioned during her portion of the presentation, there is a concern not only of immediate exploitation of this data, but also how, for example, health insurance companies and health organizations will leverage this data later on. And that is yet to be seen, as a matter of fact. Now, to my knowledge, online exploitation of this willingness to share has not led to a specific or unique exploitations yet. We, of course, risk of identity theft and fraud increase when users share more personal information online. That is timeless, regardless of the pandemic. What the belief is that, as we have seen an increased willingness to share sensitive information, we will probably see an increased risk with these cyber criminal acts that capitalize on online personal information shared in unsecure settings.
Thank you very much, Professor Anna Squicciarini and Dr. Sarah Rajtmajer. Thank you in the audience for watching and listening.
Thank you.
It was really, I was really curious. It's, you just pushed my curiosity in a certain direction, and there's so much, so much I've written I shouldn't have written, maybe, that came to my mind when I was listening to you. This tutorial is an appetizer for the vast choice of inspiration and information at the 26th European Symposium on Research in Computer Security, ESORICS 2021, organized this year by Athena, the German National Research Center for Applied Cybersecurity. Now go discover more.